Hello everyone on the internet, my name is Katarina. Welcome to my channel, Curiosity Killed a Cat. Today I will be taking you through the 10 books I read in January. January was a pretty good start to the reading year for me. I managed to read 10 books. My first read of the year was a 3-star read, and that was Cuckoo by Callie Kazumi. This book is also known by the title of Claire Darling, and having read the book, I actually prefer that title. The cover is gorgeous. This is a tense psychological thriller in which we follow Claire after her life is upended, following a very shocking breakup from her fiance, only to then find out that he's been living this entire other life that he had been hiding from her. However, nothing is quite as it seems, as Claire is quite an unreliable narrator, and the author definitely plays with that. I love an unreliable narrator, and I love that Callie Kazumi made certain choices in this novel. However, I did guess pretty much every single twist in the book. Still, it was a fun time, and the twists worked for the most part, in my opinion. I think where it gets tricky is the choice at a certain part of the book to tell the story a certain way that I think removes this question of whether or not something is real, even alludes to the reader very, very early on what might be the truth. And I think it kind of just it causes the story to actually slow down and lose steam instead of amping up. For those reasons, I gave it 3 stars, even though it was still a very fun read, and I'm excited for Callie Kazumi's other book, which is coming out in February. Next, I had my first 5-star of the year, which is Portrait of a Thief by Grace D. Lee, in which we follow a group of Chinese American college students who are recruited to pull off a series of daring heists where they're essentially stealing looted Chinese artifacts from Western museums. As an art history major, and as someone who genuinely loves a good heist movie, I'm a slut for a heist movie. I love this so much. If you enjoy Six of Crows or Babel, and if you enjoy shows like La Casa de Papel or movies like Ocean's 11, I think this one might be right up your alley. I really loved all of the characters. I loved all of the themes that were covered in it and all of the questions that came up. And that's why I compare it to Babel, because I think it deals a lot with, this idea of colonialism and language and art and ownership. And I think it's really, really interesting. It was really, really a fun time, and I'm excited to read what Grace D. Lee does next, as this was her debut novel. And I heard that it was already optioned by Netflix, so hopefully we will get a Netflix movie or show at some point soon. Next, I read Death Note, the Black Edition, Volume 4. This wasn't my favorite of the installments, and I won't go into it because it's full of spoilers. So if you haven't read the previous ones, um, it's not really fair for me to tell you what happens with this one. But just know that it wasn't my favorite storyline. I feel like it dragged a little bit, but near the end, I did get excited to find out what's going to happen in the next installment. Overall, it did kind of get a bit bothersome to get through, honestly. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. After finishing Death Note, I read Homeseeking by Carissa Chen. This is her debut novel in which we follow a couple across 60 years as world events pull them together and apart, illuminating the Chinese diaspora and exploring what it means to find home away from your homeland. This one was right up my alley. It was definitely wildly ambitious, especially with what Carissa Chen was trying to do in terms of language and how she was portraying the differences in language, where it does take a bit to catch on to all that, but I actually didn't find it to be that complicated, maybe because English itself is already a second language to me, so it's not that much of a stretch to then do a bit more of understanding towards what yet another language in it might be trying to tell us, what the nuances of it might be. I also have watched some Chinese dramas, which doesn't give me a lot of context, but maybe it helped. I don't know, because I wasn't completely unfamiliar with what Carissa Chen was trying to do or what she was trying to say. I also enjoyed how Carissa Chen framed the narration, where one half of it, one POV, is going from past to present, and then the other is going from the present to the past. Again, very, very ambitious, but I think she pulled it off so well, and ultimately I gave this one 4 stars. Now, the next book was the redemption arc for Gillian McAllister, which I mentioned in my worst reads of the year that happened, and that was for her novel Wrong Place, Wrong Time, which I gave 4 stars to. Actually, it was like 4.5, but I rounded down. This one, we follow a mother who witnesses her son committing a murder, and after which she starts traveling back through time, waking up earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier in the past, and slowly uncovering the events that ultimately led to that act and racing to essentially change the future. This one, as I said, Famous Last Words was one of my least favorite reads of last year, and a very disappointing read at the start of the year, I think. Almost at the very start. So to read this one at the start of this year and give it such a high rating and have so much fun with it, we have been redeemed. I will definitely be on the lookout for more Gillian McAllister novels that catch my eye. I'm also a big fan of time loops and time travel and the different ways that authors can play with this concept. And I think Gillian McAllister did such a really amazing job. The only issue for me is one that comes up a lot when you have a time loop or where you have a time travel story. And that one is when after a bit, it does start getting repetitive, not necessarily in, oh, she's doing the exact same things, because in this one, she's moving back through time. So it's not exactly the same, but she is repeating certain things that she's already done and talking about having done them, etc. But it's more about, the decisions that are being made and the futile stuff that she still keeps trying, which in one way are logical and I understand them, but when you put them in a novel, they get a bit tiresome to continue reading. And so for that reason, it was 4.5. But I was worrying if she was going to stick the landing, but she did. She stuck that landing. Yeah, really, really like this one. Next, I read Before We Forget Kindness by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is the 5th book in the Before the Coffee Gets Cold series, and I read this for the Buzzword reading challenge for the title with the words before and after. This 5th book, we're once again following different stories of people who come to this enigmatic little Tokyo coffee shop where customers are able to travel back in time. I actually started witnessing a certain decline in my enjoyment of the series already in like book 2 to like book 3, but then book 4 I really, really enjoyed. I felt like it was very fresh, very exciting. I unexpectedly really loved it. So I went into the 5th installment where the stories just didn't really hit. They weren't as good this time around. They're fine, but the repetition and continuous repetition just drags on and on and on, and the emotion just didn't hit me as much this time around. Toshikazu Kawaguchi can do so much more and go a lot deeper with these stories, and he just doesn't. And I don't know if it's to stay within the healing genre or if it's because he kind of purposefully keeps writing them as a play. I don't know, but I'm gonna have to consider that a bit. That really has me thinking. But overall, I gave it 3 stars. I didn't love it. I don't know if I'm going to read the next one, if there is a next one. I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Then I had my first reread of the year, and that was Unequal Affections, a Pride and Prejudice retelling by Laura S. Ormiston. As the title suggests, this is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, which picks up from when Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth Bennet, and it reimagines the rest of the story in this alternate timeline in which Elizabeth had said yes to his proposal. I love it even more this time around. It did start off as a fanfic, so you can feel it. However, I don't think that harms this book particularly because you're supposed to know the original material. You're supposed to know what happens in Pride and Prejudice. You're supposed to be invested in Pride and Prejudice, and then you're supposed to want to read this reimagining where, okay, what could possibly have happened if something in it was a bit different? And that's what drew me to it in the first place and what really excited me to read it. And I wanted to reread it because I had rewatched the 1995 miniseries, which is my personal favorite adaptation of the book with Jennifer L. and Colin Firth, who I love, love, love. I just really love the yearning and the pining and just everything, because this concept where Mr. Darcy thinks he can be content with Elizabeth not returning his feelings as long as he has her in his life and he can make her happy. And then after a while, he starts actually just really being in pain over the idea that she may never love him, and he's craving that his affections get returned. At the same time, Elizabeth is getting to actually know the real him beyond these walls and beyond the prejudices that she's had, stepping away from his pride as well. And just the connection that they made is incredible. I also love that in this book you get to see them in a relationship dynamic that you don't get to see in Pride and Prejudice. It had me giggling and kicking my feet. I loved it so much. Every single trope that I loved was in this, and I was obsessed. If you were a fan of Pride and Prejudice, and maybe are interested in what this retelling could bring. And if you like these tropes, are just pure romance in a historical romance setting, then I absolutely recommend that you pick up this one. The next book I read in January was the Hakuda Photo Studio by Herteon. In this one, we follow Jebi, who comes to vacation on Jeju Island. However, the day that she's supposed to leave Jeju Island, she loses everything: her phone, her money, her ticket, just everything. And then she stumbles upon this little photo studio and ends up getting a job there. And so she decides to stay. This is very much another book in the kind of healing genre of Korean stories. I enjoyed it for what it was, but ultimately I couldn't give it more than 3 stars because I just didn't click with it completely. Next, I read volume 18 of the One Piece Omnibus 3-in-1 edition by Chiro Oda. This one we're following the Straw Hat crew in the Saibari archipelago. They are there to get an expert varnish on their ship, the Thousand Sunny. However, they stumble upon the local slave trade, and soon the Navy is at their backs trying to catch them, and all of these different things start happening. I have to admit, this was probably my least favorite arc so far, but I'm really interested in the next one, which is Impel Down, and I'm actually really nervous about it because I have been spoiled for a certain thing that happens in One Piece, and I just don't know when exactly it happens, and I think it might be now, and I'm just so nervous about it, but we'll see. I ended up giving this one 3 stars, and I also read it for the Buzzword cover challenge, and this one was, internal body parts, and I read it because the One Piece cover for this edition has a little skull on the cover, so it counted. Last book I read in January was one of my anticipated releases for this year, which I will cover in another video, as well as one of my 26 reads in 2026, which I will cover in a video soon. And it was Half His Age by Jennette McCurdy. This is her fiction debut. In this one, we're following a young girl named Waldo, who is 17 years old and who starts up a relationship with her professor, who's much older than her. This was definitely a very harrowing read that I wouldn't recommend to everyone. I think you need to walk into it when you are prepared to deal with those kinds of topics. It is really heavy on the vulgarity of it all. I understand some of the criticisms that people have had. However, I think a lot of them are just kind of missing the point. I think it's important to talk about these topics and write about these things in all their layers and nuances, and a lot of those are quite messy and quite vulgar, and I don't think that we should be censoring how someone chooses to write it, especially when it's coming from a person who has been through it in some way. Jennette McCurdy was very open in her memoir and in her interviews about having had a relationship with a man who was twice her age when she was a minor, and so I think we should have that grace to let someone who has been through it write about these topics in a way that they want to write about them, because oftentimes it's just not being written about in this way. And I just think it's important to get that perspective out there as well, even if it makes us uncomfortable, because at the end of the day, it's meant to make us feel uncomfortable. It's meant to make us think and be critical about it, and transfer it also to our personal lives as well in some capacity. The writing could have been a bit tighter. I also think that this is just when Jennette McCurdy only starting to really hone her writing voice when it comes to fiction, so I'm really excited to see what she's going to write next. The reason for why I gave it 3 stars is because I just found that the book could have honed in on certain things a bit more, and I wish that it didn't end so abruptly, although I understand why it did. There you have it, folks. Those were all the 10 books that I read in January. What did you read this month? What did you love? What didn't you love? What are you planning on reading next? Leave all of that down below in the comments, and I will be back to you soon with my February TBR. Bye!